So how do we create this notion of abstraction and decomposition in Python, or actually in any programming language? And the answer is we introduce the idea of a reusable piece of code or a chunk of code called a function. Functions are not going to be run in a program until we actually ask them to do that. So as opposed to things I was typing into my shell, every time I typed in an expression, it was invoked or evaluated, I'm going to create a definition of a function, and when I read that in, it's simply going to create the ability to do that computation, but not actually call it. And we'll see an example of that in a second. What are the characteristics of a function? Several. First, it has a name. That makes sense. I've got to be able to refer to it in the same way that I had a variable as a name for a value. A function will have a name. It will also take a set of parameters. These are arguments or values that I'm going to use inside the function when I do a computation. It's going to make sense in a second when we look at an example. Every function has to have parameters, but the number of parameters could be 0. Or it's a funny way of saying it's going to take in a parameter list, but in fact it may need no parameters, and I'm going to decide when I create a function how many parameters I need. We'd like every function to have a docstring. That is a documentation that tells me what the function does. We'll see an example of that in a second. And finally, a function has a body. And the body is the sequence of commands or instructions that we want to actually have happen when we use the function. Those are a lot of words. Let's look at an example to get a sense of this. Here's a definition of a function, and I'm going to walk through each of these pieces. So, the first part of it is I've got a keyword, in this case def. And it is a keyword, meaning it's a special symbol to Python that tells me I'm about to define something. In this case, I'm about to define a function. That is followed by a string that is the name of the function. In this case, it's is_even or is_even. That's the name of the function I'm going to give, or the name I'm going to give to this function. That is followed in parentheses, in those parens, by 0, 1, or more parameters. In this case, I've got 1. And I'm giving it a name. Think of it like a variable name. I'm saying I'm going to use the name I as the name for a parameter inside this function. And that's then followed by a colon to tell me I'm done with the top line of the definition. I'm about to follow it with other information. So keyword def, a name, and in parens, some number of parameters. Immediately below that, in triple double quotes, which is a wonderful expression, is a docstring. It's up to you how to use this, but traditionally you would specify what's the input to this function and what's the output of this function. It's a little bit like a contract. In this case, I'm saying I'm expecting one input, I'm calling it I, and it's a positive integer. And what I'm going to return is true if I is even, otherwise I'm going to return false. As we'll see in a little bit, one of the nice things about a docstring is once I've defined this function, if I go to call it, which I'm going to get to in a second, Python will automatically bring up a little window that tells me the docstring, that reminds me what the conditions for this function are, which is great. So, keyword, name, parameters, I've got a docstring. Immediately below that is the body of the function. This is the sequence of commands or expressions I want to evaluate when I'm ready to use this. Notice the indentation. All of this is indented here. This is telling me where the body of the function is. And in fact, it will be everything until I get back to something that returns to the left-hand side of the editor or of the shell. In this case, I've got two expressions in my body. It's going to print out simply the string hi, and then it's going to return a value. We'll come back to the return in a second. There's how I write a function. Now, how do I use it? The function has a name. The same way I could use a variable as a name inside of an expression, I can use the function name. And in particular, later on in the code, I can say an expression like is_even, and then an open paren, followed by an expression whose value I'm going to use inside of that procedure, followed in this case by a closed paren because there's only one parameter. I call this invoking or calling the function. I'm using the function. We're going to look at some examples in a second, but the basic idea here is that when I call this function, I'm going to take the value 3 in this case, and everywhere I see an I in the body of the function, I'm going to use that value in place of I. And in fact, if I look at it then, inside of this particular expression, I'm going to print out simply the string hi, and then I'm going to evaluate this particular expression, and it has the keyword return followed by an actual value. Now, I just said, in this case, if I've called isEven with the parameter 3, I now holds the value 3. So I'm going to evaluate 3 remainder 2 and say, is that equal to 0? In this case, it's not because the remainder is 1. And I'm going to then return that value to whoever called this function. So that's the expression I want to evaluate and actually return. So it returns a keyword that tells me I'm ready to stop the computation, and whatever the following expression is, that is the value I'm going to give back to the person who asked for it. In this case, it was simply at my shell. But we'll see in a second, it could be somebody else that's going to use it as part of another computation.